There was something strange stirring in the old Smugglers' caves. Written by Withbite. When the tourists are here, this is the place to be. The cafes are bursting at the seams, there are parties every day on the beach, and, best of all, there are girls on holiday looking to have a good time. I turned 19 in July, and this summer was the best one ever. By the end of September, the coin had flipped. There were no more tourists. The only people left were locals, most of who I had known my whole life. I couldn't stand a lot of them, and I was related to quite a few. And the long sun-drenched days which made the coastline here on the southern tip of England radiant and irresistible had faded. Rain and wind swept constantly against the cottages lining the narrow, twisting streets of the town in which I lived. The sea battered the harbor wall and the beaches. The scenes of so many late-night romantic adventures were lost at high tide. I felt like I was the most miserable person on earth. There was nowhere to go and nothing to do. I had a few friends my own age, but after spending the summer here, they were all away at university in their freshers' year. I was the only one who had failed the exams needed to go. I had a chance to resit though, and by this time next year, I could potentially be away studying as well, and partying. I had stopped looking at my friends' posts and messages. It was making me sick with envy. Stuck as I was in this gray, dank town on the edge of nowhere. One morning recently, I could see out of my bedroom window that the rain had called a temporary truce. I had put down the textbook that I was meant to be learning from, shrugged into my thickest coat, and decided to blow some cobwebs off. The wind hit me as soon as I stepped out the door. A greasy piece of paper, most likely one that some drunk staggering home from the pub last night had eaten their fish and chips from, reared up and almost hit me in the face. I ducked just in time. This was the most exciting thing that had happened to me in weeks. I sighed and decided to go for a walk along the beach. This was a steep, short trek away, down some stone steps. It was low tide, so the beach stretched out a good way before the cold, choppy sea hit. I started walking. I wasn't really going anywhere, though a part of me would have loved to have kept going. To have just walked for miles and miles and never come back. Stupidly, incredibly stupidly for someone who had grown up here, I lost track of time. I realized this when I felt the waves lapping at my feet. I looked up and I saw the tide was coming in. I swore. Luckily though, I was close to the old Smugglers' caves. They were above the tide line and I could shelter in them. I'd be there for hours and I was already cold and hungry, but there was nothing else that I could do. I picked up my pace and with the waves hot on my heels, soon I reached the dark cavities nature had cut into the cliffs. When we were kids, our parents told us to stay away from the Smugglers' caves. They were dangerous, they told us. So, naturally, we went there all the time. My best friend when I was growing up was called Tommy. He had a mass of black curls on his head and a big grin on his face most of the time. We clambered into the Smugglers' caves to play. We were the rogues who, hundreds of years ago, smuggled brandy, gin, and rum, and made a fortune. We would shelter in the caves from the revenue men who would have hung us if they could, and counted out our wealth. There was something that we used to say as we counted. One for us, and one for the monster that lives in the caves. 2 piles of pebbles that we had brought from the beach would pile up. The monster was the hideous sea creature that legend claimed had once terrified the locals. It would rise up from its slumber on especially stormy nights and clamber up into town and rip off the heads of those who had not paid their due. As 8-year-olds, we knew better than to cross the monster, even though we were well aware it was just a daft old story. Standing in the gloom inside the caves that day, I remembered how happy I had been back then, how the world had seemed a magical place full of possibilities. My mood sunk even lower. The waves were not reaching into the caves, but the cold wind was, so I moved further in. There were a half-dozen chambers reaching deep into the cliff. The sound of the sea and the wind was soon muffled, and I was moving through close to pitch blackness until I saw a small, glowing light. The tip of a cigarette, I realized. Then the beam of a torch swept across my face. Oh hell, I thought, because I knew exactly who it was. The Michaels brothers were what my dad called bad-uns. Unlike the Smugglers' cave, he did not need to warn me to stay away from them when I was a kid. They beat me up so badly once that my wrist was broken. They pushed Tommy down the stone steps leading to the beach. He spent 6 weeks with his leg in a plaster. As they got older, they drifted into petty crime. They mostly preyed on the tourists who did not know to give them a wide berth. They would pickpocket, and they would steal cars, break into cottages rented out for the holiday season. The local police were constantly hauling them off, and they had a number of spells in juvenile detention. But they always came back to town, a little more devious, a little more vicious. Last year, they started selling drugs to the teenagers who hung out at the beach parties. I hate drugs. I've seen how they destroy lives. My best friends. Tommy died of a drug overdose when he was 18. I had no idea he had taken anything. I couldn't believe that he had. I still can't. We had talked about what the Michaels brothers were doing, making their way through the people crowded around the bonfires on the beach, stopping every now and then, handing over a packet or some pills and taking cash, then moving on. They were scum, we had agreed. I wasn't with Tommy when he collapsed. I found out later that he had died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. I went to his funeral. I stood next to his sister and his mom. I wanted to say something comforting to them, but I had no idea what. The police investigated, but even though everyone knew that it must have been the Michaels brothers who sold Tommy the drugs that killed him, nothing was ever proved. They carried on their dealing. The torchlight was being held on my face, dazzling me. A voice said my name. "Billy boy, you shouldn't have come here." I didn't know which of the brothers it was. They were both equally disgusting. Equally dangerous. I needed to get out of there. "Look, I've not seen anything," I said as I began to back away. Another voice laughed. "I hope you brought your water wings with you. You'll need them if you're going to leave the caves." He was right. I was as good as trapped until the tide fell. Still blinking in the glaring light, I could make out one of the brothers coming towards me. It was Ethan. He was older by a year. His cheeks were pitted with acne scars. He was in my face. His breath stunk. He smiled, showing his yellowed teeth. "But seeing as you're here," he said, "you can help." "No way," I said, trying to sound mean, defiant. Inside, I was scared real bad. Ethan's hand was a blur, and I recoiled as he slapped me hard in the face. Then he smiled. "This is me asking nicely," he said, and turned and walked back into the darkness. With no choice, I followed. The brothers led me deeper into the caves than I had ever been. The only sounds were our footsteps echoing and the drip of water from the cave's ceiling. We reached a new chamber, and there, piled up high, were steel containers. The torch clicked off, and a low hum started to fill the space. An orange light began to glow, revealing a heater. Then there was another sound, and portable lamps burst into life. "Cozy," Brennan, the other brother, said. He was a little older than me and had a wispy mustache and beard, more like spider webs than human hair. He turned to me and said, "Billy boy, we need to divide up the load." He pointed to the left. "Them boxes are for retail here on the beach next summer." Then to the right, "These are for distributing across the county for sale over the winter. You start with those. Open up the boxes and count the packages out into piles of 20. My face was burning with anger. "I'm not a drug dealer," I told him. Ethan sidled up alongside me, pulled out a knife, and ran its tip down the side of my face. I winced at the pain and saw blood begin to trickle down onto the floor. "I can cut you any way I choose," he said. "And then when I'm done, we'd feed you to the beast." At this, Brendan began to laugh. "Oh man, that's priceless," he said. "We'll need to slice him up real fine for the beast to be able to eat him." Ethan chuckled. There was no humor in his eyes, only a sadistic glint. "We'll see," he said, and walked away into the corner of the cave. He grabbed something. I couldn't see what, but I heard a small yelp. Then he came back over, dragging something along the ground. As he brought it up to the light, I stood open-mouthed, the stinging pain along my face momentarily forgotten about. The thing was about 3 feet long. Its body was a pale, sickly white color. 2 small red eyes peered up from its center, and a dozen skinny tendrils flapped uselessly this way and that. Ethan looked down at it. "You hungry, beast?" He spat the words out and dragged it a little further, so that it was next to where my fresh blood stained the floor of the caves. It didn't react, it just laid there. A slight ripple passing through its body was the only sign that it was even alive. Then Ethan kicked it. It began to wail a high-pitched, pathetic plea. "Useless," Ethan said. "Thought when we found you cowering in this cave you'd be of some use. Maybe could sell you to a freak show, but no, all you is useless." He kicked it again, harder. Its wail became a scream. "Don't!" I yelled. "You're hurting it." I had no idea what the thing was, but it clearly felt pain. And Ethan was hurting it and enjoying himself. Brendan stood watching stony-faced. That is, until I reached out and tried to grab hold of Ethan and pull him away. Brendan ran at me then, knocked me to the ground. Winded, I lay there. He put his boot on my chest. "Stay down, Billy boy," he said. I had no choice but to do so and to watch with growing horror as Ethan held the tip of his knife against the thing's body. "Perhaps I should cut you," he said to it, the words coming slow now and quiet. "Cut you into little pieces, and we can roast you over a barbecue and see how you taste." The thing's cries grew more desperate. Please," I said. "No." Brendan looked down at me and grinned. "When Ethan's got a bloodlust on like this, there's no stopping him." Ethan started to press the knife in, and the ground began to shake. It was a murmur at first, a gentle pressure which I could feel under my back. Then it grew rapidly and my body began to rock. Brendan lifted his boot off of me. I could see the confusion in his eyes. "What the?" he muttered. Ethan stood up, the knife by his side. "It's just a quake," he said. "Chill, bro. They're pathetic in England, quakes. Only thing that ever gets broken is teacups." Brendan did not look convinced, and I didn't blame him. The movement was intensifying. Small, sharp rocks began to fall, loosened by the motion. There was a rumbling sound as well, a roar that was getting closer and closer, until the cave floor cracked, split open, a jagged line that split and grew. It was feet away from the three of us. Brendan yelped in alarm. Ethan simply stood and stared. I was frozen to the spot, paralyzed by the shock and fear, and I could only watch as something started to rise from the cracks. They were long, slender, pale, like limbs reaching and twisting in the air. They spiraled higher and higher, and two of them found the thing, which now lay whimpering. The limbs enveloped it. It was so small, so weak, and they looked so powerful. They could crush it with ease. But no, they were wrapped gently around the thing, almost as if they were embracing it. Brendan and Ethan were not watching this. They were looking around, frantically trying to follow the progress of the other limbs that were coming ever closer to them. One reared up in front of Ethan's face. He brought his knife up to try and stab it, but the limb swatted his arm away as if it was nothing. I heard the sound of his bones breaking as it did so, heard the scream as he fell onto his knees. Brendan was trying to move away by now, stumbling backwards, but the limbs followed. They curled around his legs, dragging him down, and then began to reel him in. He was screaming as well, clawing at the cave floor with his hands in a desperate attempt to hold on. It was futile. Within seconds, he was being dragged down into the chasm below. His face contorted with fear, a last cry for help on his lips. He disappeared from sight. Ethan, too, was trapped among a tangle of limbs as well by now, but he was being taken more slowly. I could see the limbs tightening around him as they dragged. I could see his skin darkening as the breath was crushed from him, until he too was taken into the ground. I was left crying with fear. The thing also remained. It was no longer calling out in distress, but seemed content, safe within the limbs. Gently, it seemed to me. They then carried it back with them, back below the earth. I lay there for a long time, not daring to move in case the limbs returned. The ground was still though, and nothing stirred. Eventually, I managed to stand and I made my way outside on unsteady legs. When I reached the mouth of the caves, the tide was falling, enough for me to find footing on the beach. As I emerged, I told myself, I am going to study hard, and I am going to go to university, and I am going to make something out of my life starting today. And then I walked away, leaving behind the Smugglers' Caves, unmapped and ancient, a refuge from the rising waves, A place where children once played and smugglers hid. A place where the darkness waits.